Welcome to Neon Liberalism, episode number 6. I'm Jason Brigham. With me, as always, Samantha Hancox-Lee. We are joined today by the eminent economist, Maia Mindel, and we're going to be discussing Samantha's article in Liberal Currents this week, The Crisis of Gender Relations. I'm going to be talking about the patriarchal bargain, and Samantha's going to start by probably talking about what those things are. What's the crisis? What's the bargain? You don't have to take them both immediately on, Samantha, but, over the course of this, we'll get to it. So take it away.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the crisis framing. A lot of our politics these days seems consumed by gender and issues relating to gender. As you may know, one of the very first flare-ups of the incoming administration and the incoming Congress was Republican Congresswomen being infuriated that Sarah McBride, the first trans Congresswoman, or at least the first out trans Congresswoman, was going to use the same bathrooms as them, and there was a whole kerfuffle about that. At the same time, abortion was on the ballot in a variety of states. Abortion was a central issue. Recently we've seen the overturning of Roe versus Wade, and so there's a variety of issues about abortion. There are issues about trans rights that are happening everywhere. And there's also, at the same time, a lot of culture war stuff that seems more ephemeral. The world's richest man, Elon Musk, recently spent $250 million effectively by himself, a place in the new Trump administration. And what is he doing with his time? Well, he's up at 2 a.m. posting about how boobs should be bigger in video games. And, corresponding with random people on the internet saying that they're going to readjust the parameters for Grok, the AI that they run over on X, to make boobs bigger when it generates pictures. And, if we want to go a little bit farther back, there's the whole MeToo movement, Gamergate. There just seems to be this tremendous energy, to put it in something of an anodyne term, about gender these days. And so some of my article was jumping off from that, from trying to argue that these are not disconnected phenomena, that these are not many different crises. It's not a polycrisis, it is a monocrisis. That they're all expressions of the same kind of anxiety about gender relations, about a breakdown in a picture of the world that's built around a certain picture of gender roles, a picture of men and women.
Yeah, so something I would like to note is that, well, I'm not American, which is a place to bring a new perspective on this, and it's like very much a global issue. It's a global issue. Maybe I'm gonna get a bit ahead of the discussion here, but it's a global issue too, in the sense that, well, birth rates and marriage rates and whatever are falling in a lot of countries. Not all of them rich and not all of them very progressive, but also like the political aspect is present in many other countries too. Like in Latin American politics, like the last 10 years have seen an increasing prominence of stuff about like gender ideology and whatever. There's also like been a much more, next year it's going to be 10 years since it sort of took off, like a very intense wave of feminist activism and organizing and marches and everything. Which is interesting because it was earlier than in the US, but the backlash is coming a lot later, to put it in a way. For example, abortion was a huge issue in Argentina here in 2018 and 2019. Mainly, then, like, basically it was part of the demands of the feminist movement in 2015 and 16 was to put like abortion on the table because it was illegal. And like the Argentine Supreme Court is a lot more progressive than the American Supreme Court, but it's also a lot less powerful. So like the big abortion rights decision was to decide that like there was basically a discussion over an implied comma in the penal code. Then in 2018, there was like a big vote in Congress on abortion. It failed by around 2 or 3 votes in the Senate, but it was still a big win. It was seen as a big win because it was an issue that like couldn't even get any traction in the 2010s during the fairly progressive Kirchner administration, and then in 2018 it was a few votes away from passing in a much more conservative environment because the president was like a center-right not very concerned with this type of issues, but still not a progressive. And then it passed in 2020 while nobody was paying any attention. And now, well, the current president is saying he was saying this last year, but he's like abandoned everything he ran on to like a normal conservative these days. But he was saying he wanted to hold a national referendum on abortion at some point to make it illegal again. Because he's one of like the weird libertarians who considers it like murder.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point to dwell on, that this issue seems to be, I mean, is increasingly worldwide. I mean, for example, like when Putin and other Russians talk about why they're invading Ukraine, oftentimes gender will come up. So, for example, when there was early in I think the first wave of mobilization, there was a huge exodus. Hundreds of thousands of Russians left Russia to avoid being conscripted or otherwise called up. And Russian propaganda was putting out, there was one commercial where it shows this Russian couple, they're on a plane, they're leaving Russia, they want to get out. And then immediately, like drag queens show up and are like, yes, welcome to the West. We're going to teach your children about gender ideology. And the Russians are like, oh no, we can't have that. We should stay in Russia, right? You see the same sort of gender event. Something's happening in South Korea with, for example, the 4B movement, which is a feminist movement in South Korea that is, I mean, it's political lesbianism with some complications. The 4Bs, by the way, are no sex with men, no giving birth, no dating men, and no marriage with men. So yeah, there's a certain kind of rejection of something that's happening there. This is very much a response to an increasingly misogynist men in South Korea, a president who campaigned on being an anti-feminist. So yeah, I take your point that this is absolutely not an American issue, but increasingly a global phenomenon.
Yeah, the term gender ideology, if I'm not mistaken, because I might be, was originally invented in Brazil, actually. Because much like the US, Brazil has a very like militant evangelical sector or movement to say. They're very politically involved and they're very conservative. And I think that at this rate, by the end of the decade, Mexico will have more Catholics than Brazil, despite having like half the population. So basically, that's like an interesting thing to look at. That like, if you see, like, I feel like a lot of people consider that the US is a separate thing from the political developments in other countries. When like if you understand it in this sort of global perspective, I think it makes a lot more sense for the current environment.
I think that's right. So these things are all happening around the world, but many of these, there's like cross-pollination of ideas and of language between these different events. So like you say, gender ideology from Brazil, obviously a lot of the contemporary anti-trans movement in America is lifting ideas from Britain and the British TERF movement. And similarly, I mean, again, Putin, when this one always just stuck with me, when he's explaining why Russia has invaded Ukraine, he says the West is trying to cancel Russia like they canceled J.K. Rowling, which is an insane thing to say when you're explaining why you have invaded your neighbor. But it really shows just how worldwide and interconnected these crises are.
I mean, the importance that these issues, the importance of the role they're playing today is unbelievably remarkable to me. Say that you went back 15 years ago and you spoke to some men who are like analysts of world politics or something and said, what drives world issues and conflicts and things like this? And they probably would have said something like economic issues and nationalism. And those would have been probably issues number 1 and number 1A. And it never would have even occurred to them to talk about some of this other stuff, which is clearly highly motivating. I mean, I do not think at all that these issues are just being played up for political purposes. I absolutely think they're driving a lot of what's going on. And look at the last U.S. election, and this won't prove that the issues are not being trumped up for political purposes, but probably the number one issue for each campaign in the last U.S. presidential election was gender. It was trans issues for Mr. Trump, and it was abortion for Ms. Harris. It's remarkable. I think, if you had any honest male analyst from 15 years ago, they would just not be able to cope with how important these issues are now.
Yeah, I think so. This you said that you contrasted, gender issues with economic issues and nationalism.
Because they're totally separate. No, I'm just kidding.
Exactly.
Yeah, one is identity politics, the other is real politics.
No, I think there's absolutely that kind of framing that we're familiar with. There's the culture war, which is ephemeral and full of emotion and not really based on material facts. And then there's this other stuff, which is about economics and geopolitics and national power. And one of the things that I wanted to talk, or I did talk about in this essay, was this place where they come together very clearly. An issue that is very, like, the right is increasingly obsessed with, and for that reason, liberals are often a little leery of even talking about. And that issue is birth rates, right? So the brief overview of birth rates is that they're going down. You may have heard they're going down. They've been going down pretty steadily since, well, I mean, let's do a brief demographic history. For most of human history, birth rates are very high, very high. The numbers exactly vary from country to country, or from group, region to region, time to time. But, the average pre-modern woman is going to spend most of her adult life either nursing or pregnant. And at the same time, death rates are really high. Death rates in childhood are really high. And these are also, just generally speaking, society with higher death rates, even for adults, than we have. And so human populations are relatively stable and they're relatively low. This changes kind of dramatically, broadly speaking, with the industrial agricultural revolutions. Productivity starts shooting way up. We start getting modern science, modern sanitation, modern healthcare, modern medical science. So birth rates stay really high, but death rates go way, way down, especially infant mortality. And as a result, we get these population explosions. To take one example, in the essay, I talk about Europe and I talk about Africa. So in 1800, Europe had a population of 195 million. In 2000, Europe had a population of 727 million. In 1800, Africa had a population of 81 million. In 2000, it had a population of 809 million. So really dramatic expansions of the human population in the last couple centuries. And now that's all changing. Death rates have remained very low, but birth rates are coming down, and in many places are below replacement rate, which is about 2.1 births per woman. And one of the things I want to focus on here is what Maya alluded to earlier, which is that it used to be thought that this was a purely economic phenomenon, that it was just, well, you got to a certain point in economic development and your birth rates would start to go down. But if you were poor, your birth rates would still stay really high. And that was true for a while, but it seems to be changing lately. That even relatively poor countries in the world are seeing rapid declines in the birth rate. The population estimate curve for Africa has recently been revised pretty far down because of the way that fertility and economic development have started to come uncoupled. And to kind of bring this all back to this question of gender and economics and nationalism, South Korea provides a good example here, where in South Korea, the total fertility rate is 0.8. Each woman can, on average, over the, across the nation, 0.8 children.
0.8.
less than one,
and you had said it was 2.1 is the replacement rate.
Just under a third of the replacement rate.
0.8, that's right. So I mean, we're talking about a country that is going to, each generation is going to be less than half the size of the previous generation, and this is going to pose some problems for them economically. For example, that they will have for the foreseeable future, have a very, what they call a top-heavy population pyramid, where you don't have many people working and you have a lot of people who are retired. And that's going to cost. And it's going to be harder and harder to afford what we would call Social Security, to pay for people's retirement. There's going to be less stuff available for the workers for investment. So there's that. And of course, as you may know, South Korea is still, I believe, technically at war with North Korea. There is no peace treaty that has ended that war. It's just a frozen conflict. And if your country is having in size each generation, you have a serious security problem on your border that can pose a very real material geopolitical problem. Or alternatively, if you don't have that conflict, simply a problem for your conception of national power. So I think this is an area where all these different concerns really do come together.
Yeah, yes. Like South Korea is, I think, a very, very unique case. Like a lot of people say that every country is going to be as bad as South Korea, but I don't really think that's a very realistic assessment because it's a country that's sort of at the edge of how bad it gets, basically, both in terms of birth rates and in terms of gender relations. Because first of all, you have a draft that's exclusively for men. For example, Israel doesn't has a draft, but it's for men and women, so there's like not that sort of tension between them. So that very clearly has created a rift in a way. Like a lot of men in interviews and everything mention that they're like aggrieved by women being able to travel abroad and work and everything. And there's also like something that a lot of people don't really know is that being drafted into the military is actually like quite bad for your economic prospects. Like it's a really complicated issue, and a lot of that is like sort of stemmed by the fact that the most studies use Vietnam veterans, and the Vietnam War draft wasn't actually random because they didn't like move around the balls enough for it to be random. But like if you look at studies from the Argentinian military draft, there's always a local angle for me. You can see that basically going to being drafted into the military increases your chances of committing crimes and being imprisoned quite a bit. And the effect is a lot bigger for the Navy, which had a 2 year. You were drafted for 2 years instead of one. So the authors kind of speculate that the results are because you're not in the labor market for a year or two. And in the US, a lot of the harms of being drafted and not working for 2 years and coming back with no skills except violence basically are kind of offset by the fact that you get an education because of the GI bill. And you're not going to get every man in South Korea free college education. So there's a harm. There's actually a harm that they're like kind of right about.
No, I think that's all correct. I mean, first of all, that I don't bring up South Korea because I'm trying to suggest that inevitably everyone is going to wind up in that situation, but they're kind of an example of what is possible and why it's maybe something we might want to avoid. And I think like the case of the draft is interesting because it kind of shows how South Korea, at least from an outsider's perspective, feels like it's locked into this kind of radicalization spiral where, yeah, the draft, it is a sexist institution and it's bad for men. And their reaction has been to become more misogynist and more patriarchal instead of saying, well, maybe we should just draft everybody, right? We could gender integrate the military and actually do something about the problem, but or move to an all volunteer force. I don't know, like whatever. There's other questions about how you organize your military here.
Yeah.
But it's precisely that the conditions are bad and it's driving people to double down to some extent on the causes of the problems rather than on their solutions, which is kind of not a dynamic you want to be a part of.
Yeah, it's very interesting because you have men who, I mean, let's be honest, have put themselves into a disadvantageous position, and their solution isn't like, well, we should just like take into consideration that women are as good as men, and instead they say like, no, we need to oppress women a little bit more, and that way we can get ahead. And you can see like, I feel like that sort of logic is very, very present in most of these topics of discourse because like a lot of people are operating on the idea that like there's been a deviation from the natural dynamics, and so that's causing like the imbalances that you see, and that like if women just went back to their place, which is the kitchen, then it would like be resolved.
No, I think that's right. And again, you see this in America. So, for example, the Federalist recently had an article talking about birth rates, arguing that, if you, what did they say? If you want to do something about fertility decline, we should, get rid of the policies that are encouraging it. And then you look at the policies in question and their education. They want to decrease college education and they want to cut public education. And like the subtext here is that they want to do it for women specifically.
Yeah, women are more educated than men on average in most countries.
Yes, that is absolutely true. And you can see like the implicit logic is they think, well, if we start hacking away at education, we're going to return things to how they were, to how it's natural, right, for women to be less educated, to have fewer options, and to spend more time in the kitchen being pregnant. Basically, that's kind of the position they have here.
Yeah, like in the economy, like I think that like I don't really think that this is just an economic issue, but there is a very clear like economic through line here, which is that like the economy has been, but it's like especially now transitioning away from like an economy where hard skills are prioritized into one that's like a lot more focused on soft skills. Like it and like manual labor is becoming an increasingly unimportant part of the economy, particularly in countries that don't build a lot of housing and infrastructure like the US, which is like a whole other thing, I think. But you're seeing these economic changes that they sort of put men in a position where they're not really well equipped to compete from like the traditional masculine standpoint, because you have an economy where women have stronger interpersonal skills, stronger like with the soft skills. You have women becoming more educated. There's like a lot of complications because you don't go to college and get like a degree in shop and then you become employable. It's like a very like the degree choice and everything still matters. And then you also have like a lot of social stigma around men going into, well, not going into certain professions that are perceived as feminine. Well, there's actually not that much social stigma. Like something that's kind of crazy is that if you look at like studies on whether men agree that like men should be more like traditionally masculine or not, most men don't agree that like men should be less, emotionally sensitive or whatever. But the problem is that they don't, like they think that other men do think that. So they're sort of like stuck in not being able to act and speak on it. And like to take a really extreme example in the Gulf countries, so like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc., you see that, for example, men support their wives working and women want to work, but they are both concerned with like their peers trashing them. So in a way, like when women got the right to work, there was a crackdown of sorts in other activities that women were doing, in large part to help, like so that men wouldn't be like perceived as soft on their wives by other men, which is, crazy.
Well, yeah.
So, what Maya's starting to talk about there at the end is the idea of preference and choice, and this is a big contrast and sort of a turning point, I think, in your essay, Samantha. We introduce, or you introduce, these ideas of structural factors or inexorable forces. I don't know what the right word to use is, that are driving birth rates down. There's economic forces. We've talked about the effect of military draft, for example, and education. And then you get to this sentence: What is relevant to the birth rate is how many children women want to have, right? And so you introduced this survey data that apparently American women want to have more children, and South Korean women want to have fewer. Um, and so this notion of choice and preference, starts to uh, is important. You're arguing it's very important, and it's not conventionally talked about a whole lot.
Yeah, I think this is a complicated subject. The argument I make in the essay is that on some level, there's an intertwining of material and cultural factors in this area, and that there's something material has broken down and has failed to work in the way that it used to work, but the cultural legacy of it lives on. It's the patriarchal bargain. This is something you referred to earlier. The patriarchal bargain is a concept developed by Denise Candioti, feminist scholar. She argues that societies under what she calls classical patriarchy are characterized by kind of a bargain. Not like anyone ever signs a contract, but like we can kind of understand it as a bargain, as an exchange between men and women, in which men provide economic and physical security and women provide reproductive labor. And that means childbearing, it means child rearing, it means guarantees of paternity, for example. And this is not to say that women don't engage in economic labor. Women have always engaged in economic labor, sometimes outside the house, sometimes in domestic production. But in these highly patriarchal societies, they don't control the terms of that labor, right? They make work, but they don't really have the option to like sell that produce on a free market, right? It's effectively only possible through like the bank account belongs to the husband, to put it metaphorically or quite literally.
Yeah, in fact, and well, this comes from Claudia Goldin, who won Nobel Prize a few years, like last 2 years ago, I think. And one of the facts from her, like sort of work in general that struck me the most is that until the 1990s, the time in American history that had the highest female participation in the labor force was actually the Revolutionary era. Because like what she talks about is how like poor economies are usually overwhelmingly agrarian. So, and that's a very, very labor intensive sector. So women just had to work like constantly because otherwise the entire family would starve. And then when economies start transitioning into manufacturing, and something that you see is actually that services and manufacturing like both take off at the same time, and then manufacturing sort of plateaus and services continue growing. But at that time, because manufacturing is so lucrative, men sort of take the upper hand economically and become the providers in a way. And then like usually this is accompanied by higher like female education as well. And because the services sector is also growing, you start seeing like a time and play like over time you start seeing that it's too costly for women to stay at the home looking after kids and everything. But firstly, because people just have fewer kids. We were talking about this like a while back. And secondly, because like the benefits to working either in like a low skill service position or like just professionally is very high. Actually, women in the US started joining the labor force. There were a lot of cultural factors that made women joining the workforce acceptable, particularly the two world wars, which like made men more open to their wives and their daughters working because their mothers had worked. But basically, college for women was mostly a matchmaking service. Women just went to college to find an educated, wealthy husband, and the returns for finding a husband from like when you went to college, you could get a certain lifestyle return in a way from your husband or from getting a job yourself. especially because women weren't legally allowed to work in much of the US until the 50s and 60s, anyways, like married women. And then it shifted because, like, the structure of the economy shifted and cultural norms shifted at the same time.
Yeah, so this I think really illustrates an analysis I like of the patriarchal bargain and how it worked and why it is breaking down, which is an analysis due to North Wallace and Weingast. Yeah, everybody knows, everybody in liberal currents knows those names. Um,
Yeah.
uh, but this picture of a form of social dynamic that is the rent exclusion dynamic, where what you do is you have one group of society that is excluded from full social participation. And this generates rents to the people who aren't excluded because there's some stuff that only they can do. And that generates them an outsized, material return. And then they use that outsized material return to reinforce the exclusion of whoever it is that they happen to be excluding. And North Wallace and Weingast argue that this is characteristic of, for example, medieval societies, that there are the aristocracy and they control all the important stuff in society, like, the castles and the horses and the mills. And this means that like everybody else produces, but they're able to extract a fraction of that production, not because they themselves produce anything, but just because they have excluded everybody else from the important things in life. And then they use all that money or resources functionally to reinforce their own power. And this is functionally what sustains the patriarchal bargain that Candioti is talking about, right? That you are talking about societies in which women are excluded from full social participation. And the root causes of this exclusion are kind of various. There's clearly some that are cultural. Alice Evans has done some interesting work on the spread of Purdah through India, where we can clearly see it's a matter of cultural diffusion and not a matter of any kind of economic change. There's other kinds of studies that seems to suggest that the transition from hoe-based agriculture to plow-based agriculture has some part in this by changing the economic returns to female labor, creates a rent for men. So, and these things kind of feed back into each other. And what Maia has just talked about is how this dynamic breaks down in the era of the industrial, the Great Revolution in economic productivity, when returns to labor outside of the house, outside of domestic labor, returns, on the free market, so to speak, just keep on going up. And I think it's really interesting that you mention World War I and World War II as like these big breaking moments when that really like of themselves increase female labor force participation, which shows the way that these are intertwined material and cultural situations, where there's this material crisis that kind of drives a lot of women out of the house and into labor force participation. And this creates a cultural change that makes it more acceptable, which, leads to more female labor force participation, so on and so forth, the rise of dual income households. I know that's one of your particular issues, so maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah, of course.
But just generally speaking, that the exclusion of women in economic terms is breaking down because there's too much of an opportunity cost to not. And so we see more and more women having options outside of the patriarchal bargain, right? More and more women who don't actually need men for economic security or physical security. But the cultural inheritance of this system endures. And I think you really illustrated that earlier when you were talking about the Gulf states and various other kinds of surveys where people themselves don't necessarily feel like they agree with the terms of patriarchy, but they know it, and they're right, honestly, that it's still a part of their culture, right? That it's like in the air around them, that people are going to judge them if they step out of the scripts, the rules that the patriarchal bargain has provided for men and for women.
Yeah, there's like a really long time ago I read, and then I reread it a bit by the philosopher slash sociologist Sigmund Bauman, where he talks about like the change in modernity. It's a whole part of like his really complicated book, but the only part that really stuck out to me was about gender, because he talks about how like in like old-fashioned modernity, to give the name one modernity and post-modernity, or in like during the industrial era, men could like derive meaning and a sense of self and everything from being producers, because they went out and like worked and were the breadwinners. And women derived meaning also as producers because they produced children, and like their job, quote unquote, was in the home, basically. And then like because of changes to the economy and culture and neoliberalism and all these other things that like he thinks are really bad, even though women like became full citizens, he thinks that like everyone's identity just got subsided into consumer. But I also think that he kind of missed that women can also like, it became acceptable for women to get like an identity and derive meaning from being workers in a way that like men didn't really like get to keep, because, well, but first of all, because the sources of work changed, and secondly because like it's not like a cultural thing anymore to say like the men work, because like of course they do, they've always worked. And so you're sort of in like in this cultural stage where like the culture has progressed enough that women live meaningful lives as mothers, but also as workers and as consumers. And men don't really like, it's seen as like sort of frivolous and superficial for men to spend money on like themselves mostly. And they also like don't really have like the socially defined role of like the breadwinner, the one who works. It's also like not really a thing that men are like, well, I'm happy because I'm a father and I just stay home at home with my kids. And so like if you look at how straight couples make like career decisions about the two partners, it's usually in a way that prioritizes the man's career over the woman's. For example, in long distance relationships, they move to wherever the man lives, and like the woman's career usually suffers. And in couples where women start out earning men, they are at a much higher likelihood of splitting up, but also the woman starts working a lot less after a while. And you know, in gay couples, this doesn't happen. Well, lesbian women make more money than straight women, controlling for education, blah blah blah. And that's usually because they tend to just like have a more they tend to split usually childcare, but domestic responsibilities more evenly. So lesbians have like longer commutes than straight women because like they it's not like understood that they have to be like more available to pick up the kids or whatever. And like gay men, individual gay men, it's a myth that gay men make more money than straight men. It's just like a matter of which that like men who openly identify as gay are like more educated and living in like wealthier locations. But gay men, like individually, usually make less money than straight men. But gay households make as much money as straight households. So it's kind of like they just also seem to split domestic responsibilities more evenly.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there. I think one of the key things you were talking about is the way people derive a sense of identity from these combined economic and gender and reproductive roles. I mean, like, I talked about the patriarchal bargain in like very cynical terms, but for the people who are in it, who are really in it, it's not, they don't see it quite so cynically. And this is one of the flaws with North Wallace and Winecast's general project, is that it's overly economist and that it doesn't really reflect the role of values. and the stories people tell to justify these kinds of social systems and that make them seem good. So like you were saying, in the terms of patriarchy, like, and as any conservative today will tell you, like there's a sense of self and identity you derive from being, quote unquote, a good mother. And we have an image of what a good mother is. And there's a sense of self and identity you derive from being a good father. And we have an idea. I mean, you listener, you know what I'm talking about when I say a good father and like what that means in this older sense. People prioritize these identities, prioritize these psychic wages, even at the expense of material wages, as you were talking about. Right, that you could, that heterosexual households could earn more money if women, if they split domestic responsibilities more evenly, but they don't, because some dynamic between them and each other and society tends to drive women towards working a little bit less and doing a bit more domestic responsibilities, and drives men towards maybe doing less domestic responsibilities.
Yeah, like if you look at single parenthood, which is like another issue that it's like been really taken up by these like sort of bandits and discourse types. What you see is actually that I mean the worst outcomes of the children of single parents are usually just because they have less money, the mothers. And if you look at why single mothers like don't want to raise their kids with like the fathers of these kids, it's because they're like not really guys that you want raising your kids. Back in the day, like if you were like your options as a single mother were like be socially vilified and also not have any money, or or like get married to a guy who's kind of an asshole, but like at least he provides. And now like he doesn't even provide and he won't do anything at home either. So it's like my girlfriend likes talking about this by saying that like if you're a man and you get married to like a woman with low earnings potential, you basically get like a living maid and nanny. And if you're a woman and you get married to a guy with low earnings potential, you get like a stay-at-home gamer. And obviously that's a bit excessive and a bit like rude and whatever. Like but it is true that like men refusing to pull their weight in the house, like between air quotes, does play a really big role in how like these women see their relationships.
No, I mean, I think this is accurate. I mean, kind of fascinatingly, I think David Frum basically endorsed this analysis recently, which is a real shock to the system for somebody who knows David Frum's career. Right, but this reflects, like you say, that the breakdown of the patriarchal bargain in material terms, in the sense that, these women, they have options, right? They don't need to accept the shit sandwich, because the alternative is being out on the street. It's like, yeah, I mean, it's not great, being a single mom, but it's maybe better than being hooked to a deadbeat dad. And at the same time, we see like the cultural breakdown, this cultural tension, this friction where men aren't, or not all men, obviously not all men, but like many men are unable to adapt to the situation. That they're unable to make themselves a compelling bargain for women, right? Like you say, like this is a woman, that wants something out of a relationship. She wants somebody who will, be a good person, who will help around the house, who will care for her and, be emotionally available. And these guys just can't get there, right? The cultural scripts of masculinity are tying them. Oh, I see, Jason, you wanna jump in on this one?
Well, like you were saying, as these economic forces that were giving a lot of shape to the patriarchal bargain are fading, it also seems that the narrative of masculinity has also lost some of its shape. It's definitely changed. I mean, I think you're seeing a younger generation in these online spaces sort of making up what they imagined masculinity was, maybe to some extent because there's this absence of the forces that used to structure it in some ways, and maybe those forces gave it some of its cultural meaning. And as those forces are gone, the cultural meaning has sort of shifted. I mean, I think, if you went, I said earlier, if you went back 15 years ago, and I'm going to say it again, if you went back 15 years ago, I think a lot of people, a lot of men would be very stunned at some of the things that are sort of openly held up online as like masculine behavior or identity, talking openly about how you think female characters should be presented in video games. That's an example you brought up. And it's kind of amazing to me that people would do that. But that seems to be like part and parcel of like, yeah, men complain about how women look in video games on the internet. That's what a man does. And that's like an amazing thing to contemplate. I just don't think that is, I don't think that is fits well with traditional masculine identity, that men would have been thought to go around talking about such a thing. That's remarkable. And so I just sort of say that's just one example, but like the idea is that these younger men are maybe grasping for an identity as a man, a masculine identity, and what they are constructing and putting forward as that masculine identity is different from what came before. There is a newness about this identity that is being built.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm like for completely unrelated reasons. I'm listening to a podcast about the power broker, like the biography of like the urban planner Robert Moses, and they talk about why like everyone was so into building parks in the 1920s, which is how he got like his prestige and reputation and his power. And a lot of that was because like all of these guys in like the 1910s were starting to get concerned that with like manufacturing and urban living, that like men were forgetting how to do like how to do like physical labor. Men were getting too weak because they were like not out in nature anymore. And that was like that was like completely nonsensical. They like made it up on the spot as like something that defined the man. But it's sort of interesting because like it's both of the like a man is someone who like gets mad when boobs aren't big enough in video games. It's kind of the same thing as like a man is someone who like chops wood in the forest or something. And like what and I think that like a lot of this is because people are like a lot more lonely and a lot more socially isolated than in the past. So a lot of this stuff just like gets moved online. So, you have fewer men like knowing women, and like having female friends or like having male friends even. And they pass like a lot of people just spend most of their time on their phones or watching on video games or watching TV. And you also see like that these online spaces are completely unrealistic things about women and men. Like you see all of these guys talking about how like the average woman has slept with 50 to 100 men, and like the actual number is 4 to 6. And so like basically these guys are just like and like the lack of social interaction between men and women in a lot of ways is like driving this sort of like rift, because these guys just don't know any women or many other men, and they're like so they're like well, I think that like the average woman has slept with 100 guys, and like they're all these massive sluts, and that's what Andrew Tate told me. And so like they don't have like a female friend who will say no, actually like the actual number is like 4. So
Yeah, I think
like this was getting somewhere, I promise. And so like when you look at like what the economists think, like in more recent work, this is really funny because I got this idea from a paper titled "Why Women Won," that dropped the same day, by Claudia Goldin, that dropped the same day she won her Nobel Prize. And she says it's a mix of like feminist activism, basically like women basically organizing and demanding more, But it's also had to do with like men getting a stake in like their wives and their daughters, like their lives, because men saw that like uh, basically men were like I don't want my daughter's husband to treat her like my friends treat their wives. And so like because there isn't really a like a comparison for like, well, I mean, I don't want my daughter's boyfriend to talk about her the way that like these guys online talk about their girlfriends or talk about women. So there's sort of like so there starts building up like a gap between the genders.
No, I think that's all correct. I mean, one thing you'll see occasionally is this suggestion that conservatives, especially the really reactionary types, the gripers, are porn-brained. Not in the sense that they're like addicted to porn or that they're always talking about it, but that their worldview is kind of shaped by online porn that they consume and the porn narratives, basically. And you can kind of see this in uh, trad wife content. Um, right, right. Well, so trad wife content, for those who have not experienced this particular horror, is basically a kind of an internet personality, a woman who is like performing traditional femininity. You know, it'll be some Instagram clip of her making cupcakes in the kitchen for her husband. But, you know, when she's doing it, she is perfectly made up and just popping out of that apron. You know, and like this is just right on the edge of like, is this political activism or is this fetish content or is it both? And either way, it's not really connected to the real material conditions of women today or women in the 50s, frankly. This is not what the housewife life was like. And I think this gets to what you're talking about, Maya, and this, you know, people feel the ground shifting under their feet and they retreat into a kind of nostalgia politics. Except it's not a nostalgia for anything real exactly. It's this invented, imagined nostalgia that exists these days just on screens, you know, in this kind of information ecosystem. And, you know, in the case of the manosphere, people like Andrew Tate, various others, clearly a very toxic ecosystem that is in some ways not even good for the people who consume it, right? It's not, this is not, you know, Andrew Tate might give you some advice, but it's not functional advice for like actually meeting people in the real world. It's just, you know, a fantasy that you engage in on your screen.
Yeah, Andrew Tate is in a lot of ways like a really old-fashioned character because he's like one of these guys who is like, if you're, you know, a huge asshole to women, they're gonna like want you so bad. And so like, and when you look at like that, like the incels, like the involuntarily celibate movement, they sort of emerge as like a reaction to guys like this. So basically in the 2000s, there was like a pickup artist community who were like these guys who did like party tricks. They brought like fake lint and they put it on women's clothes and were like, oh, you have this. And but basically they were like these really awkward guys with like really awkward and cringy and annoying pickup techniques. And they were like, well, if you do this, you're gonna like be able to get laid, basically. And you know, they were like awful and misogynistic and whatever. A lot of these guys were with like really young girls, and in like a shockingly predictive twist of the turn of events, the guy who was like the main guru in the pickup sphere had a mental breakdown and started like planning a murder suicide of his dad shortly after, and uh, drawing up a plan to move to like Slovakia and like start sex trafficking women, basically. So yeah, I mean, these weren't like nice guys, and the incels and these guys were like red pilled because of the Matrix, of course, and the incels were like black pilled. They say like, no, actually, like you're not going to get laid even if you do all of these like stupid, annoying techniques because like you're too like inferior. So like the only option is violence. And so like Andrew Tate is like he sort of wants to make men red pilled again. And like there's like a sort of disconnect between like the more old fashioned misogynists who are like the guys who say like, well, women want a strong man and talk about like women use the word bitches and stuff like that, and like the newer, like the creepy ones, the like the porn brained groiper types, which like a lot of people are like, well, I mean, I think that it's kind of weird how, you know, Donald Trump has like the religious Bible thumpers and the guys who are like who and the locker room talk guys, air quotes in locker room talk, and also like the online porn addicts, and like it's not really a contradiction. None of them like women. That's like their whole thing.
Yeah, so I think that's all correct. And I guess to start to wrap this all up, where we finally come back to people posting weird stuff on the internet about women. And, I mean, it's my view that there are real material changes that people are responding to in economics, in the workforce, in what women are in society, that we have options, that are not just shacking up with shitty men, that we can live our own lives, and that these are material changes that are going to be very difficult to undo because they're just the condition of the modern world in certain economic terms. But there's so much cultural weight that was placed on these foundations, and now it's all coming apart. And so we see so much anxiety about gender. So many people trying desperately to recreate something that they cannot recreate and that they don't even really understand. And that's probably going to continue until we can find a more stable gender equilibrium, a set of stories we can tell ourselves about men and about women and what makes a good man and what makes a good woman and what men and women are to each other, and tell and promulgate and get people to accept these stories, for themselves, for their own sense of self-worth. And ultimately, it needs to be both men and women and culture generally that makes this acceptance happen.
Well, Samantha, Maya, I think that was a pretty good conversation. And
Certainly had a good time.
Yeah, yeah, it was all good.
thank you so much for coming on, Maya. And I think that's a wrap for Neon Liberalism number 6. We'll be back again next week.